All right, so let's dive into something a bit on the darker side today. Serial killers. Yeah, little morbid, I know. But admit it, you've got to be at least a little curious, right?
Everyone is.
Yeah. And today we're going beyond the usual true crime stuff. We're going to take a look at the big picture of gender and serial murder.
Okay.
And we've got some really fascinating data for this, like an academic analysis that covers like centuries of information.
Wow, centuries.
Centuries.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What's really interesting about all this data is it helps debunk some of those common assumptions that people have about serial killers.
Yeah.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
All right, let's dive into a topic that's both fascinating and maybe a little bit unsettling. The world of serial killers.
Mm.
You know, I bet everyone listening has their own image in their head of what a serial killer looks like, thanks to all those true crime documentaries we love. But what if what we see on TV is actually leading us in the wrong direction?
Yeah.
What if the reality of serial killers is way more complex, especially when we look at gender?
Mm.
And that's what we're looking at today, using these research excerpts that you sent over.
Yeah, it's a really great point, You see, the data actually gives us some pretty surprising information when it comes to male versus female serial killers.
Okay.
You might actually be pretty shocked to find out that women, like on average, actually have a lot more victims compared to men.
Hold on. Seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So all those names that we always hear about, Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, are those guys actually outliers when it comes to like the number of victims?
Well, it's not that they're outliers. It's more about like how long they can get away with it, I guess.
Right.
Studies show that female serial killers like average over 20 victims,
Wow.
while men usually fall somewhere between like 10 and 15.
Okay. That's kind of unsettling. But why? Why the difference? Are women just like better at hiding what they're doing?
I mean, that's definitely part of it. Male serial killers often go for those big, splashy, violent crimes, shootings, stabbings,
Yeah.
the type of stuff that grabs all the headlines and gets everyone talking, triggers those huge manhunts. It's like they really want the attention, they want to be famous.
Oh, yeah.
And that obviously makes it easier to catch them.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of hard to miss a crime scene when there's blood everywhere.
Exactly. But women, they tend to be more, how should I put it, subtle. Yeah, their methods usually involve things like poison, suffocation, things that could like very easily be mistaken for natural causes.
Oh, wow.
Or just accidents, especially if they're working in like a caregiving role.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So they can really just like blend right into the background.
So not to like sound morbid or anything, but it's like there's this paradox. Like the quieter the method, the more people they're able to hurt over time.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for us to really understand the differences between men and women.
Yeah.
It's not just about being curious about this stuff. It's also about actually potentially saving lives.
Right. Because if investigators are always looking for those big, noticeable crimes, then the more subtle ones just slip through the cracks.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine someone like Nanny Doss. The giggling granny.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of her.
She poisoned all these husbands, like over decades, and no one suspected anything.
Wow.
And it wasn't until they finally realized there was a pattern that she got caught.
Right.
So that's why it's so important for us to understand the more like subtle tactics that women use. It's really important for criminal profiling.
Right. Okay, so we've got these very different ways that they're killing people, and then this difference in, like, how many people they kill.
Yeah.
But what's driving all of this? Is it nature versus nurture? Are women just kind of wired to be, like, quieter and more sneaky in their violence?
That's what makes this all so interesting, you know?
Right.
Because if it was just biology, we'd be seeing those numbers be more even across the board, right?
Yeah.
But that's not what we're seeing. The answer is probably somewhere in a mix of social factors and historical context.
Okay, so we're not just talking about some instinct here. We're talking about, like, social forces and even how we perceive what it means to be a man or a woman. All of that's playing into this.
Exactly. Just think about it, you know. For centuries, women were expected to stay at home. Their lives were all about kids and housework. Very limited chances to even interact with people outside of the family.
Right.
It's not exactly an environment that creates the type of, like, hunting and stalking that we usually see from male serial killers.
So you're saying that all of those limitations actually kind of, like, forced women to commit their crimes in different ways?
It's a really cool insight. It completely changes how we usually look at serial killers, right?
Right.
It's not just about someone being evil. It's about figuring out how all these outside factors can, like, shape how those impulses play out.
That's really interesting. Okay, so let's go back in time a bit. Can we even track these trends over time historically? Like, do we have data on serial killers, especially women, from, like, the 1800s or before that?
We do have some records, but as you can imagine, they're kind of all over the place, especially before the 1900s.
Right.
There are just so many cases where the gender of the killer is just unknown.
So does that mean that there were always female serial killers? They were just harder to catch?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe their crimes were just ignored because they didn't fit that male monster stereotype?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely possible. And it shows us how much, like, how we view things, even in law enforcement, has been shaped by these biases and the fact that we don't have a lot of information from back then. But when we get to the early 1900s, we start to see some patterns emerge.
Okay, let's hear it. What were they seeing back then?
Well, as we get into the 20th century, you know, the early 1900s, we start to see this gradual increase in male serial killers that are actually recorded.
Okay.
Now, some of this is probably because police work was getting better and there was more media coverage. And honestly, back then, people were just way more focused on the idea of a man being the criminal.
Right. So it's like society was almost expecting a man to be the monster. So those cases gave more attention, more resources, so we ended up with more records about them, which probably made the data even more skewed, right?
You got it. But even then, we do see female serial killers popping up, even though it's very likely that a lot of those cases just went unreported.
And then you've got the post-war period, the 50s and 60s, when society and the economy were going through huge changes. It's interesting because we see a little bit of an increase in serial killings overall. Maybe it was all that stress going on in society.
Right.
You know, more people were vulnerable, and that gave predators more opportunities.
It really makes you think about how much those changes in society back then played a role in shaping how serial killers operated, right?
It's a super interesting question to think about. And remember, this is also when forensic science is getting better.
Yeah.
So the data we have now can more clearly tell the difference between men and women who are committing these crimes.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about the golden age of serial killers, that has to be like the 70s through the 90s.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
That's like what we see in all the movies when it seemed like every news story was about a serial killer. What was it about that time that made it so, like, the perfect time for those types of crimes? Well, for one thing, there was this huge surge in interest in serial killers, both from the media and, like, law enforcement. Agencies were talking to each other more. There were more resources for investigations.
Yeah.
And of course, the media just ate it up.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they even exaggerated some of these cases, honestly, and that all led to this huge increase in the number of recorded male serial killers.
But didn't we also start seeing more female serial killers in the data during that time, too?
They did, but there were still so many more crimes committed by men that women kind of got overshadowed. But it does suggest that because investigations were getting better, those quieter crimes, the ones done by women, were finally being recognized for what they were.
Right.
It wasn't just, you know, a random incident or a family tragedy. It was a pattern of planned, cold-blooded murder.
So fast forward to now, the 2000s and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
What's it looking like these days? Are those numbers still going up?
Well, it actually seems like they might be going down overall, or at least leveling off. It could be because of a few things, like forensics are better now, so we can identify killers faster, and maybe there are better prevention programs out there, and maybe, just maybe, some of those changes in society that we talked about earlier are having an impact.
So are we, winning the fight against serial killers?
I don't think it's that simple. I mean, yeah, the overall numbers might be down, but the percentage of female serial killers seems to be about the same. They're still out there, and they're still using those same, chillingly effective methods.
Wow.
And that's why it's just so crucial to understand those differences between men and women. It's not about scaring people. It's about giving law enforcement the tools they need to recognize these cases early on, to see past the stereotypes and catch these people before they hurt anyone else.
Because if we're just focused on that classic idea of a, male monster, we could miss those smaller signs, those patterns that could help us stop something before it happens.
Right.
We could be missing important pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that takes us back to why we're even doing this whole deep dive,
Yeah.
It's about questioning what we think we know, understanding the little details, and using that knowledge to make things safer for everyone.
Okay, we've talked about trends over time, the difference in victims, the different ways they kill people. But it feels like we've only just started to scratch the surface of why all of this is happening. Let's go deeper.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's talk about nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
Is there really something different in the brains of men and women that makes one more likely to be violent?
Right.
Are we talking about biology, or is it more about how society shapes us?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that criminologists and psychologists have been arguing about forever. Some researchers think it's about biology, like different hormone levels or aggression, but most people agree that it's way more complicated than just saying men are aggressive and women are passive.
Right, because if it was just biology, then we'd be seeing an equal number of male and female serial killers, and we know that's not true.
Exactly. So that brings us to nurture, how we're raised and the cultural norms that we're taught and how all of that interacts with gender. Just think about it. We live in a world where boys are taught to be assertive and dominant and even to be aggressive.
Yeah.
It's all part of what it means to be masculine, to be a man.
And then on the other side, girls are taught to be more passive and nurturing and to avoid conflict. If a girl gets angry or shows aggression, it's seen as a bad thing.
Exactly. And those messages that we learn early on can really affect how we all, both men and women, deal with anger, frustration, and feeling powerless.
Right.
For some people, especially women who are taught to hold their anger instead of letting it out, those bottled up emotions might come out in those sneakier, more hidden forms of aggression that we see in female serial killers.
So it's not like a simple cause and effect. But you're saying that those societal expectations about gender can create a situation where those darker impulses develop in specific ways, depending on whether you're a man or a woman.
Exactly. It's not like every boy who's told to man up or every girl who's told to be sweet is going to become a serial killer, obviously. It's way more nuanced than that. It's about figuring out how someone's individual psychology, their own experiences, and the messages they get from the world all mixed together.
Right. And we can't ignore history here either.
Right.
For centuries, women were basically stuck at home, and they couldn't do a lot of things because of what society expected of them. It's not exactly an environment that encourages the kind of hunting and stalking that we see with a lot of male serial killers.
That's true. But this is where things get really interesting. Those very limitations, the fact that women were often so close to people who were vulnerable, that might have actually shaped the ways that female serial killers choose to kill. Poison, suffocation, those quiet methods that are easy to hide and that often target family members or people they're taking care of. It's a pretty scary example of how opportunity and necessity can combine with those internalized societal pressures and create a very specific kind of predator, one that we often don't even notice.
It's like the way they kill is a direct result of those limitations, a twisted way of adapting to their situation. But we can't forget about motivation, right?
Yeah.
What drives these people to do such awful things? And are there differences in what motivates men versus women?
That's where we really start to see how men and women are different psychologically. If you look at the research, male serial killers are often driven by those classic motivations, power, control, dominance.
Yeah.
And often they get a sadistic pleasure out of causing pain and terror.
It's like they're acting out those fantasies that we see in so many movies. The hunter stalking his prey, the puppet master controlling everyone, the need to have power over other people. And often there's a sexual element to those fantasies too, right? Like a need to possess and control their victims in a way that makes them feel powerful.
Right. But with women, the motivations often seem more, I guess you could say, more practical, more about achieving a specific goal. While there are definitely cases of female serial killers who are driven by rage or revenge or even some kind of twisted sense of justice, a lot of them seem to be motivated by more practical things like getting money, getting rid of obstacles, or protecting themselves or the people they care about.
So it's less about the act of killing and more about what they want to achieve. Like they're thinking of murder as just a problem that needs to be solved.
That's a really good way to put it. It shows just how important it is to understand these nuances, these seemingly small differences that can actually have a huge impact on how we investigate, prevent, and ultimately deal with this whole phenomenon.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we finish up our deep dive into serial killers, I want to talk about something that's been on my mind.
Okay, what is it?
We talked about how media and pop culture often give us these wrong ideas about serial killers, especially the male monster trope.
Right.
But I'm curious, with all the data we've looked at, do you think those portrayals are starting to change? Are we seeing more accurate, more nuanced depictions of female serial killers in movies, books, documentaries, all of that?
That's a great question, and one that's really important to think about. I mean, on one hand, I think we've made some progress. The popularity of true crime has definitely made people more interested in female offenders like Aileen Wuornos or Juana Barraza. We're seeing more documentaries, podcasts, even fictional stories that really dig into their stories, their methods, their motivations.
Right. It's not just the same old crazy killer dude story anymore. We're seeing more about manipulation, about those quieter, sneakier tactics that women often use.
Exactly. And that's important because it makes us question those assumptions we talked about earlier. There's assumptions that might have made investigators ignore or dismiss women who were suspects in the past.
But I wonder if it's really balanced yet. I mean, let's be honest. The names everyone knows, the most famous serial killers, they're still mostly men. Ted Bundy's practically a household name. Why do you think that's still the case?
There are a few reasons, I think. First, you've got history. For decades, it was male serial killers who were in the news, who captured people's imaginations. Those early cases, the ones that were really brutal and got a lot of attention, they solidified that image of the male monster in our minds. And the media had a lot to do with that. The way they told those stories, the focus on the killer's mind, the way they almost made them into legends, it all added to that lasting image.
And let's be real, there's also the entertainment factor, right?
Yeah. Those stories about male killers, especially the ones who are charming or clever, they just appeal to more people. It's easier to make a good thriller about someone like Ted Bundy, with the nice guy act hiding a dark mind, the game of cat and mouse with the police, the sheer brutality of the crimes. It's a formula that works.
Exactly. And I think there's also something deeper going on in society here.
Okay.
We've talked about how traditional gender roles have shaped the opportunities and methods, but they also affect how we understand and react to these crimes. The idea that women are naturally nurturing, caregivers, people who couldn't possibly do such horrible things, it just clashes with our image of a cold-blooded killer.
So are you saying that we're almost more willing to accept the male monster story because it fits into how we already think about gender and violence? Like it's easier to swallow, less disturbing to our worldview?
That's a really smart observation. And it's not just about how audiences react. It can also influence how these cases are investigated and prosecuted in the real world. Wait, really? So those same biases we see in the media can actually affect how the police do their jobs.
Absolutely. There are so many cases where female suspects were completely overlooked or dismissed because their crimes didn't fit the typical profile of a serial killer. Their methods were too quiet, their motives too complicated, they seemed too normal to raise any red flags.
That's terrifying. So even though we're getting better at recognizing these patterns, those ingrained stereotypes can still have really serious, really dangerous consequences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to push for more accurate, more nuanced portrayals of serial killers in all kinds of media. It's not about making them look good. It's about showing the whole picture of this phenomenon, regardless of gender. It's about understanding what we're dealing with.
Because in the end, what we really want is to prevent these things from happening, right?
Right.
The more we understand these people, what motivates them, how they do what they do, the better we are at identifying them and stopping them before they hurt anyone else.
Exactly. And that means we have to constantly question what we think we know.
Yeah.
challenge the stories we've been told, and accept the uncomfortable truth that darkness can hide in the most unexpected places.
All right, I think it's time to address the big question here.
Okay.
We've talked about the gender differences in serial killers, the historical trends, how the media influences how we see them, but we haven't really talked about so what? Why should anyone listening to this even care? What's the takeaway?
That's the important question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've laid out the facts, explored all the complexities, but what does it all actually mean for the person listening right now, taking all of this in? Why does understanding the differences between male and female serial killers even matter in the big picture?
Exactly. It's not just about being interested in creepy stuff, right?
No.
This knowledge can actually change how we prevent crime, how law enforcement works, and even how we see the roles of men and women in society.
Absolutely. First and foremost, it can make criminal profiling better. By understanding the specific patterns and motivations of male and female serial killers, investigators can potentially identify suspects faster, connect cases that seem unrelated, and ultimately stop future tragedies from happening.
Because if we're only looking for the stereotypical male monster, we might miss those subtler, quieter cases that are slipping through the cracks.
Right.
It's about broadening our understanding of what a serial killer can look like, how they operate, and what drives them.
Exactly. And it's not just about catching the bad guys. It's about understanding the root causes, the societal and cultural factors that contribute to this kind of extreme violence in the first place.
Are you saying that by studying these gender differences, we might be able to identify those risk factors, those warning signs that someone is headed down a dangerous path?
Precisely. And that knowledge can be used for everything from social programs that address childhood trauma and aggression to interventions designed to help people who might be struggling with mental health issues or feelings of isolation and powerlessness.
Because at the end of the day, what we really want is to create a world where these horrible crimes don't happen as often.
Right.
It's about prevention, not just punishment.
Exactly. And that requires a comprehensive approach that considers everything we've talked about today. Gender, socialization, opportunity, motivation, the complex interplay between all of them. It's not an easy solution, but it's a necessary one.
It's a big challenge, but one that's definitely worth tackling. Okay, we've really gone deep into this dark subject, explored those scary realities, and hopefully come out of it with a better understanding of what makes these twisted minds tick. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listener with one last thought, a bit of a challenge, if you will.
Okay, I'm listening.
We've talked about how the media often gives us the wrong ideas about things, but it can also be a powerful force for change. So here's my challenge. The next time you hear a story about a serial killer, whether it's on the news, in a documentary, or even in a fictional story, pay attention to how gender is portrayed.
That's a great point. Look for the subtle biases, the ways the story might be reinforcing or challenging those traditional ideas about violence in men and women.
Because the more we think critically about those portrayals, the more we demand accurate, nuanced representations. The closer we get to a world where understanding beats fear and prevention becomes the ultimate goal. Don't just take those stories at face value, Really think about what you're seeing and hearing. Ask yourself, is this just another stereotype?
Yeah.
Is it really showing me how complicated this all is?
I mean, we've been hearing these same stories about serial killers for so long that we've kind of forgotten to even question them.
Right.
We need to look deeper.
Yeah.
Challenge those simple answers.
Because, if we're not careful, all those biases, they can make us miss important clues.
Right.
They can make us doubt people who might actually be the killer. And that could even put innocent people in danger.
It's true. That's why it's so important to think critically, to really be aware of the assumptions that we all make, and to always question the stories that we're being told.
Yeah, we need to train our brains to see past what's right in front of us, to look for those hidden patterns, those unexpected connections, the stuff that could be right there, but we're just not seeing it.
Yeah, that's when knowledge becomes really powerful.
Right.
It helps us see the world in a totally new way,
Right.
to question the things that limit our understanding, and to accept that things are complicated.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of serial killers. We've explored those chilling statistics, unpacked those really complex motivations, and looked at how gender plays a role that we might not always even realize.
And all throughout this deep dive, we've emphasized how important it is to think critically, to not settle for easy answers, and to recognize that the more we know, the better we understand, and ultimately, the safer we can make the world.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day with everything we've talked about today in mind, I hope you'll remember these lessons.
Yeah.
Be curious, ask questions, and never stop trying to learn more about the forces that shape our lives.
Because, in the end, that's what the deep dive is all about. Giving you the tools to be informed, engaged, and to really think for yourself.
That's right. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.